Welcome to Campfire Horror, a place of spooky tales from across the globe, based on the accounts of real people. Sit back, relax, and let the scares begin. Search and Rescue Officer's Tale. I've been in Search and Rescue Officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are thing, and they don't wander far. But I've cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds. And in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. Possession at a funeral. I have relatives in Malaysia, and I recently went to a funeral there. This story was told to me by a relative when he saw the same priest who was performing the rites for my dead relative. He said this same priest performed rites for another guy in Kedah in Malaysia, and something epic happened. Even this priest told them that it was the first time he had witnessed such things. By the way, my relative was at both funerals. Just some background, funerals in Malaysia usually last one night or 2 nights, and the rites are long, and it is not uncommon to stretch into 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., except for KL. So for this other funeral, the priest and relatives were calling back the spirit at about 11 p.m. The streets were quiet, and there were no winds. They tried a few times, but to no avail. After more than a few tries, suddenly the dogs on the streets whined and barked, and the winds suddenly blew strongly. Exactly at this moment, one of the relatives, a young guy in about early 20s, suddenly jumped up. They were kneeling down and shouted, "She's back!" and knocked all the others who were kneeling down. He then ran into a room in the house and was apparently shaken. The rest ran into the room to check on him, and this guy suddenly was possessed and spoke in a strange tongue. 4 to 5 strong men tried to subdue him, but couldn't. The priest then realized that this guy was wearing a Buddha pendant, amulet, the type whereby there's a Buddha in a box on his neck, and he pulled it out immediately. The guy then collapsed and fainted, but woke up shortly after. Just when everyone thought everything was over, the priest was explaining that this guy committed a sin by wearing a Buddha pendant and kneeling down in front of the deceased, and shouldn't kneel down to people. That's why he was possessed. When the priest was explaining halfway, and everyone was taking a rest, suddenly, the mom of the guy who was possessed went to the coffin and shouted loudly at the corpse. She shouted, "You are dead, and you shouldn't come back to harm the living." The priest rushed outside the house to the coffin where this auntie was, and immediately used his gear, charmed gadget, stuff, to contain the situation. The rites that we see on TV that priests usually do. This auntie then calmed down and fainted. After all these happened, everyone was scared and nobody really dared to do anything. The priest then explained what was going on. He also asked if this family were praying to a master or sorts, because this auntie was possessed by a master, and the relatives said yes. Note that this family wasn't from this Malaysia state, and this was the first time they met the priest. The priest wrapped up the rites, got everyone to sit down, and explained what happened. He said, for the first case, the young guy, he shouldn't wear a Buddha pendant and kneel in front of the deceased, and reminded everyone next time not to do the same thing. As for the second case, the auntie was too overwhelmed with emotions when she saw her son being possessed, and this invoked the master to possess her. A Namamahay's whisper. This story happened in 1996 in my birthplace, Mariveles, Bataan, Philippines, when I was just 10 years old. Even though it was over 2 decades ago, the memory is burned into my mind like a scar that refuses to fade. Let's just say I've always had a heightened sensitivity to things most people can't see, hear, or feel. This is just one of the many experiences that have haunted me. It was a gloomy, rainy Sunday afternoon. Our old house, long gone now, was a creaky, 2-story Spanish-style relic with wooden floors that groaned underfoot and Capiz shell windows that rattled in the wind. My grandparents slept downstairs, while my parents, my younger sister and I occupied the second floor. My bed was right next to a large window, so close I could almost touch the rain outside when it poured. I just finished my homework and decided to head upstairs to relax. Clutching my newly purchased comics, I started ascending the narrow wooden staircase. The steps creaked with each movement, their sound almost swallowed by the steady drumming of rain on the roof. As I reached the last few steps, I noticed movement beyond the curtain that separated the living room from the kitchen. Someone was sweeping the floor. I couldn't see the person's face, just the rhythmic motion of the broom brushing back and forth, the figure partially hidden behind the curtain. Assuming it was my mother, I casually called out, "Mom, I'll just be in the room, okay?" No response. The sweeping paused for a brief moment, as though the figure had heard me, then resumed. Shrugging it off, I went into the room and flopped onto my bed, burying myself in the pages of my comic book. But something wasn't right. A cold draft crept through the room, despite the window being shut. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. An unshakable sense of dread began to settle over me, as if I were being watched. I set the comic book down and went back to the staircase. Peeking out, I saw the broom still moving, brushing the floor back and forth with an unnerving steadiness. The figure behind the curtain was still at work, the faint sound of sweeping blending with the rain. I called out again, my voice shaky this time. "Mom, come to the room with me." Silence. The sweeping continued, but no voice replied. The air felt thick and oppressive, like the weight of a storm pressing down on my chest. Then, out of nowhere, a gust of wind rushed through the house. The curtain billowed outward, revealing no one. The broom was sweeping the floor on its own. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My legs felt like lead, my breath caught in my throat. The broom dropped to the floor with a loud thud. That sound jolted me out of my paralysis. I turned and bolted down the stairs, my bare feet barely touching the wooden planks. It felt like I flew down in 2 steps, though I knew there were at least 10. I ran straight to my grandmother, who was sitting quietly in the dimly lit dining area. Through ragged breaths, I tried to explain what I'd seen. She listened, her face calm but serious. After handing me a cup of water, she spoke in her usual soothing voice. "Namamahay. "What's that?" I asked, still trembling. "An uninvited spirit," she said. "They're harmless usually. They think they're still alive, so they do the chores they used to do. Sweeping, washing dishes, turning on lights. I've heard it too. Sometimes I hear dishes clinking late at night, or see the lights flicker between 2 and 4 in the morning." Just as she finished, my mother emerged from the restroom, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked at me and asked, "Have you finished your homework?" The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. My mother wasn't upstairs. That was just the beginning. After that day, the house became a stage for more unexplained events. I would hear whispers in the dark, catch glimpses of shadows moving where they shouldn't, and feel an overwhelming sense of dread at night. Was it all real? Or was it just the overactive imagination of a frightened child? Even now, I'm not entirely sure. But one thing I do know. I'll never forget the sight of that broom, sweeping an empty floor, guided by hands I couldn't see. A Krabi diving incident. The story I'm about to share came from a close friend of mine. He's always been a rational, devout Buddhist, firmly believing that as long as one leads a virtuous life, there's nothing to fear from the supernatural. He'd often say, "Humans are scarier than ghosts, and ghosts are more afraid of us." But after this trip, he never spoke like that again. This group of 8 couples, all recently married, planned a diving trip to Krabi. Among them was Kelvin, who had what some call the third eye, the ability to see spirits. It wasn't something he flaunted, but those close to him knew he'd had encounters with the unseen for years. When they arrived at the resort, Kelvin confided in my friend that the beach felt dirty. He didn't elaborate, but it was clear he sensed something was off. Despite this, the group checked into their rooms, all side by side along a corridor. Kelvin, however, delayed going to his room, requesting a change at the reception desk. When my friend asked why, Kelvin hesitated before explaining. There was a girl standing on the balcony of his original room. She was dressed in a traditional Thai costume, her face eerily close to the wall, unmoving. The room also reeked of an overwhelming sandalwood scent. Kelvin, shaken, chose not to take any chances. The group moved on, snorkeling and preparing for their dive. Kelvin and my friend kept the eerie incident to themselves, not wanting to alarm the others. But during the dive, Kelvin went missing. Everyone panicked, searching the water and surfacing repeatedly, only to find no trace of him. Then, as they glanced back at the boat, Kelvin was suddenly there, waving and shouting at them. When they reunited, Kelvin was furious, claiming he had been the one searching for them. He insisted the boat had disappeared, leaving him stranded. No one could explain the discrepancy. Later, the dive manager confirmed that Kelvin had been visible on the boat the entire time, waving to the group, even when they were frantically searching for him in the water. That night, Kelvin seemed unsettled. He told my friend about a strange fish he had seen during the dive. It had stared at him, motionless, before darting away. When he followed it, the fish reappeared, closer each time, leading him further into the water. Suddenly, he realized he was alone. No boat, no divers, nothing. He swam in circles, disoriented, before somehow finding his way back to the boat. At dinner, Kelvin's behavior grew even stranger. He spoke cryptically, reminiscing about their time together and wondering if they would ever gather like this again. His words unsettled the group, but they brushed it off, attributing it to the day's stress. Later that night, Kelvin vanished again. His wife frantically woke the others, and they searched the resort, eventually deciding to check the room Kelvin had refused earlier. Though the room was supposed to be vacant, they heard the faint sound of a TV. When they opened the door, the smell of sandalwood hit them like a wave. Kelvin was inside, asleep on the bed. He had no memory of how he got there. The group insisted Kelvin and his wife stay with another couple for the rest of the trip. The atmosphere was tense, and everyone was counting down the hours until they could leave. On their final day, they went jet skiing. Kelvin's jet ski flipped, and he didn't resurface immediately. Panic erupted as everyone dived into the water searching. Finally, someone spotted him at the bottom of the shallow sea, lifeless. He was pulled to shore, but despite CPR and medical intervention, Kelvin was pronounced dead at the hospital. The autopsy revealed he had drowned, but there was an inexplicable detail. His lungs were half filled with sand. Kelvin's body was returned to his hometown for the funeral. That night, a strange event occurred. One group of friends left the funeral home early, but got hopelessly lost, driving in circles on familiar roads. When they flagged down a police car for help, the officers led them back to the funeral home, where they reluctantly stayed the rest of the night. Kelvin's wife later remarked, "Maybe he just wanted us to stay together a little longer." 2 months after the funeral, Kelvin's wife discovered she was pregnant. She hadn't told anyone, but the timing suggested the conception occurred around the time of Kelvin's death. The baby, a girl, was named Kelly in his memory. A feng shui master later told Kelvin's wife that the child's fate was deeply intertwined with Kelvin's passing. The master also warned that the girl must never be left alone near water until the age of 7, as the water will take her. The group never went on another trip together. They drifted apart, unwilling to relive the memories of that cursed vacation. Kelly is now 12 years old. The story of Kelvin's drowning, with the mysterious sand in his lungs, was reported in a local newspaper. Holiday or horror day. My friends and I scored a great deal for a 4-day, 3-night stay at a resort on a remote island. The resort consisted of private villas, and ours was a spacious 3-bedroom setup with the living, dining, and kitchen areas on the ground floor and bedrooms upstairs. Excited about the getaway, the 5 of us settled in, ready to have an amazing time. The first 2 nights passed without incident. On the 3rd day, however, 2 of our friends decided to leave abruptly, insisting they return that evening. Despite our attempts to change their minds, they were adamant. That night, the remaining 3 of us were lounging in the living room when my male friend suddenly announced, "Let's go to sleep now," even though it was just 10 p.m. This was highly unusual for us, as we usually stayed up into the early hours of the morning. He added, almost in a commanding tone, "And we're sleeping in your room tonight." Before I could object, he lowered his voice and said, "Don't ask questions. I'll explain upstairs." My other friend and I refused to move until he told us what was going on. Reluctantly, he scribbled something on a slip of paper and passed it to us. On it, he had written, "I saw something outside." That was all the explanation we needed to pack up and head upstairs to my room. Once there, he described what had happened. While washing his hands in the kitchen earlier, he had glanced out of the window and noticed a figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, hovering beside a tree, less than 10 meters from our villa. The area was dimly lit by a ground spotlight, but it provided enough illumination for him to make out her form. Her long hair covered her face, and as his gaze traveled downward, he realized she had no legs, just an ethereal, floating body. Shaken but composed, he laid out a plan for the night. we would all sleep in the same room for safety. He suggested my room since it was the master bedroom, equipped with an attached bathroom and a TV. He would smoke in the room to deter the entity, believing that the smoke might repel it. We would leave the lights and TV on all night, hoping the noise and brightness would ward off any unwelcome presence. Though skeptical at first, we trusted him enough to go along with the plan. Later that night, strange things began to happen. My friends heard footsteps ascending the creaking staircase. Assuming it was me going to fetch a glass of water, they dismissed it, until they noticed our bedroom door had been left ajar, even though we'd locked it before bed. To make matters more unsettling, while my friends were sweating profusely despite the air conditioning, I felt inexplicably cold, constantly tugging at the blanket for warmth. The next morning, over breakfast, we pieced together the strange events. I hadn't left the room at all during the night. I had been fast asleep. My friends were perplexed as to why they felt unbearably hot while I shivered. Before leaving the island later that day, we casually mentioned our experience to the resort staff. To our surprise, they didn't seem shocked. They explained that the island had a history of strange occurrences, given its past as a rural village with numerous cemeteries scattered across the area. To make matters worse, our villa was located near one of these burial grounds. As we swapped stories, the staff even shared their own chilling encounters and tales from neighboring resorts. Back home, I recounted the events to others, and their theories varied. The entity had been watching us since our arrival and chose to appear when our group became smaller, perceiving us as less intimidating. It might have been drawn to residual energy left behind by one of our friends who had departed earlier. The strange chill I felt could have been caused by the entity lingering near my side of the bed. One final detail stood out in hindsight. The villa's wooden blinds, though visually appealing, were designed in a peculiar way. At night, anyone outside could see into the villa clearly, while those inside could see nothing of the outside. During the day, this effect reversed. At first, we criticized the impractical design, but now it seemed deliberate, as if the builders had intended to shield occupants from the watchful eyes of night visitors. Looking back, we couldn't help but wonder if the villa was designed to keep us ignorant of what lurked in the shadows. If you like our new video format, don't forget to like and subscribe to Campfire Horror for more spooky Asian horror stories. We really appreciate it.